Standing by the river, a vision comes to Daniel regarding a ram with 2 horns, and one was taller than the other. Later in the chapter, he tells us that the ram is the Medo-Persian Empire, and that the 2 horns are the 2 powers, and that the highest horn is the Persians. He sees the ram pushing west, north, and south, and none could stop him. He had conquered all regions from the Caspian Sea to Egypt. Then he sees a goat with 1 horn. Later in this chapter, he identifies the goat as the king of Greece, Alexander the Great. Daniel sees the goat run into the ram with all his fury. When Alexander's army met Darius on the field of battle at Arbela, Grantus, and at Issus, he had 35,000 soldiers, and Darius had 500,000. In the first battle, Alexander lost 500, and Darius lost 100,000. As the prophet says, he ran into him with all his fury. The goat became great. Of course, he ruled the world. And his horn was broken. That is, Alexander died. And 4 horns sprang up in its place. His 4 generals will rule the world. A little horn sprang up from the Seleucids that ruled Syria. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes, who attacked the Holy Land and desecrated the temple and took away the daily sacrifice for 2,300 days. The exposition section will describe in detail this foul character. And now for my verse-by-verse exposition of Daniel chapter 8. Verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. In the year of 548 B.C., which was the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, a vision came to Daniel. He was probably 21 when he was exiled, and about 86 years old at this time. A vision may occur when awake or in ecstasy. However, the former one occurred when he was asleep, according to Daniel 7:1. The representation would seem to have been made to pass before his mind in open day and when fully awake. Verse 2. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw, that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. Daniel was living in the palace in the city of Shushan in Persia. When he seen the vision, he was standing beside the river Ulai. However, at this time the Babylonian Empire was still in existence and will continue until 539 B.C., or, in other words, 10 more years. It was probably a summer palace, and Daniel, who was a high-ranking government official and therefore could be at any one of the palaces. This city is now a gloomy wilderness inhabited by lions, hyenas, and other beasts of prey. Verse 3. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the highest came up last. In this vision, he sees a ram with two horns and one higher than the other. In verse 20, Daniel says that the ram with the two horns are the two kings of Persia. So the vision will be about the Medo-Persian Empire. This empire consisted of 127 provinces and extended from India to Ethiopia, the boundaries of the then known world. Two horns represent the two powers, the Medes and the Persians, and one higher than the other means that the Persian power rose higher than the Medes. Verse 20 tells us that the two horns are the two kings of Media and Persia. Verse 4, I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will, and became great. In the previous verse, we learned that the ram was the empire of Medo-Persia. This ram was extending its possessions in three directions. East is not mentioned because none of her conquests were in that direction. She pushed west and conquered Babylonia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Asia Minor. She pushed north and conquered Colchis, Armenia, Iberia, and the regions around the Caspian Sea. She pushed south and conquered the regions of Palestine, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Libya. It became great and had subdued to itself a large portion of the world, extending from India to Ethiopia. Verse 5, And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. In the vision, Daniel sees an he-goat with one horn. The goat represents the Greek or Macedonian Empire. The goat touched not the ground surely represents the swiftness of the movement of Alexander's army. Quoting from Daniel 8:21, the rough goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. End of quote. The Greeks were known as the goat people from antiquity. It is remarkable that Alexander's son by Roxana was named Alexander Aegeus, or the son of the goat, and some of Alexander's successors are represented in their coins with goat's horns. Bronze figures of a goat have been found as a symbol of Macedon. When Alexander came to Jerusalem, a group of priests met him and showed him the prophecies of Daniel, and he perceived that they were referring to him, and so he bestowed great favors upon the Jews. I will quote a portion of what Josephus wrote in his book, Antiquities of the Jews. Quote, And when he understood that he was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priest and the multitude of the citizens. The procession was venerable, and the manner of it different from that of other nations. It reached to a place called Sapha, which name translated into Greek signifies a prospect, for you have thence a prospect both of Jerusalem and of the temple. And when the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans that followed him thought that they should have liberty to plunder the city and torment the high priest to death, which the king's displeasure fairly promised them, the very reverse of it happened. For Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the golden plate wherein the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and adored that name, and first saluted the high priest. The Jews also did all together with one voice salute Alexander and encompass him about, whereupon the king of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, and supposed him disoriented in his mind. However, Parmenio alone went up to him and asked him how it came to pass that when all others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews, to whom he replied, I did not adore him, but that God who hath honored him with his high priesthood, for I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army, and would give me the dominion over the Persians, whence it is that, having seen no other in that habit, and now seeing this person in it, and remembering that vision, and the exhortation which I had in my dream, I believe that I bring this army under the divine conduct, and shall therewith conquer Darius, and destroy the power of the Persians, and that all things will succeed according to what is in my own mind. And when he had said this to Parmenio, and had given the high priest his right hand, the priest ran along by him, and he came into the city. And when he went up into the temple, he offered sacrifice to God according to the high priest's direction, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priest. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended, and as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. But the next day he called them to him, and bid them ask what favors they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers, and might pay no tribute on the 7th year. He granted all they desired. And when they entreated him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, he willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And when he said to the multitude that if any of them would enlist themselves in his army, on this condition that they should continue under the laws of their forefathers and live according to them, he was willing to take them with him. Many were ready to accompany him in his wars. Josephus, Book 11, Chapter 8, Article 5, end of quote. Verse 6. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. Alexander the Great, king of Macedonia, conqueror of the Persian Empire, was probably the greatest military genius of all times. He conquered the world in 12 years, and he gathered a mighty strong host and ruled over countries and nations and kings who became tributaries unto him. On his way to conquer Tyre, he passed through Jerusalem, and the high priest showed Alexander the prophecies of the prophet Daniel. When he read the sacred writings, he was convinced that he was the person mentioned as the goat with one horn. Armed with this information, Alexander is ready to take on the Persian Empire. The greatest and most impressive battle of all was when Alex met the king of Persia by the name of Darius. While Darius awaited his reinforcements in Babylon, Alexander was thrusting south across the rocky, volcanic uplands of Cappadocia under a burning August sun. Between them and the coastal plains stretched the great barrier of the Taurus Mountains. The only pass was a deep, twisting canyon. Alexander, understandably, anticipated trouble at the gates. But there was no one guarding the pass through the Taurus Mountains. Alexander himself said afterwards that he never had a more amazing piece of luck in his entire career. Having defeated the Persian Empire, which ruled from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, from this time forward no one could defeat Alexander. Verse 7. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. And he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. This represents the fierceness and fury with which he attacked the Persians at the Grantus, at Ittus, and Arbela, with which he overthrew and invaded their country. Alexander acted as if he were furiously enraged. On the eve of the battle, Darius sent 10 chief relatives to sue for peace. When they had presented their conditions to Alexander, he said, "Heaven cannot support 2 sons, nor the earth 2 masters." So the goat with 1 horn stomped the ram with 2 horns. Any world history book will give you the full story of Alexander the Great conquering the world. Verse 8. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. The prophet said that when he was strong, that the great horn, Alexander, would be broken, and that 4 notable ones would rise up from the 4 winds. At the age of 33, he drank the Herculean cup and laid in a drunken coma for 10 days before he expired. The kingdom did not go to his sons, but was divided among his 4 generals, and they ruled the empire, which was divided into north, south, east, and west, the 4 winds. The following quote is from the Nicene Library. Quote, "Again, the sons of Greece celebrate Alexander the Macedonian as the conqueror of many and diverse nations, yet we find that he was removed by an early death, before he had reached maturity, being carried off by the effects of revelry and drunkenness. His whole life embraced but the space of 32 years, and his reign extended to no more than 1/3 of that period. Unsparing as the thunderbolt, he advanced through streams of blood and reduced entire nations and cities, young and old, to utter slavery. But when he had scarcely arrived at the maturity of life and was lamenting the loss of youthful pleasures, death fell upon him with terrible stroke, and that he might not longer outrage the human race, cut him off in a foreign land, an hostile land, childless, without successor, and homeless. His kingdom was instantly dismembered, each of his officers taken away and appropriating a portion for himself, and yet this man is extolled for such deeds as these. Eusebius, Book 1, Chapter 7. End of quote. The following quote is from the first book of Maccabees. It informs us of Alexander's parentage and homeland, that he was a noted warrior, and that he lived to the age of 33, and when he died, he parted his kingdom among his honorable men. Quoting now from the book of First Maccabees. And it happened, after that Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came out of the land of Chittim, had smitten Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, that he reigned in his stead, the first over Greece, and made many wars, and won many strongholds, and slew the kings of the earth, and went through to the ends of the earth, and took spoils of many nations, insomuch that the earth was quiet before him. Whereupon he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up, and he gathered a mighty strong host, and ruled over countries and nations and kings, who became tributaries unto him. And after that these things he fell sick, and perceived that he should die. Wherefore he called his servants, such as were honorable, and had been brought up with him from his youth, and parted his kingdom among them while he was yet alive. So Alexander reigned 12 years and died. First Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 1 through 7, end of quote. Verse 9. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. Watch carefully, because Daniel says that out of one of them came forth a little horn. So, the little horn must come from one of the 4 notable ones of the previous verse. We therefore identify him as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the younger son of Antiochus the Great, who usurped the kingdom to the prejudice of his son Demetrius, son of his elder brother Seleucus Philopater. I will try to lay the facts of history before your mind. Quote, Alexander's kingdom was now divided among his 4 generals. Seleucus ruled Syria and the east. Lysimachus ruled Bithynia and Thrace. Ptolemy Soter ruled Egypt, and Cassander ruled Macedonia. Barnes' General History, page 153, end of quote. Here are Alexander's successors. Alexander's principal generals, soon after his death, divided his empire among themselves. A mortal struggle of 22 years followed, during which these officers, released from the strong hand of their master, fought, quarreled, grasped, and wrangled like loosened tigers in an amphitheater. The greed and jealousy of the generals, or kings as they were called, were equaled only by the treachery of their own men. Finally, by the decisive battle of Ipsus in 301 B.C., the conflict was ended, and the following distribution of territory made. Ptolemy received Egypt and conquered all of Palestine, Phoenicia, and Cyprus. Lysimachus received Tharus and nearly all of Asia Minor. Seleucus received Syria and the east, and he afterward conquered Asia Minor. Lysimachus by that time had been slain. Cassander received Macedon and Greece. The succession of princes who reigned in Antioch from Seleucus to Antiochus Epiphanes were as follows. By presenting the succession of kings, you will readily see that Antiochus Epiphanes was out of one of the 4 horns. Here are the 7. Number 1 was Seleucus Nicanor. He ruled from BC 312 to BC 280. Second was Antiochus Soter, his son, who ruled from 280 to 261. Third was Antiochus Theos, his son, ruled 206 from 261 to 247. Fourth, Seleucus Callininus, his son, ruled from 247 to 226. Fifth, Alexander, his son, ruled from 226 to 223. Sixth, Antiochus the Great, his brother, ruled from 223 to 187. Seventh, Antiochus Epiphanes, his brother, ruled from 176 to 164. It was not long until the others, leaving only 2, absorbed 2 of these kingdoms which occupy our attention, namely Syria and Egypt. These 2 kingdoms will hereafter in Daniel be referred to as the kingdom of the north, Syria, and kingdom of the south, Egypt. There was constant hostility toward each other. This present verse has to do with the kingdom of Syria and one of its kings who was one of the most vile and wicked men in history. He will be pushing toward Egypt, east toward Persia, and toward the pleasant land, Palestine. Verse 10, And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. The following quote from the history of Josephus about Antiochus Epiphanes will show how he fulfills the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8, verse 9 through 27. It will further expose all the futuristic interpretations that are prevalent today. Quote, At the same time that Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, had a quarrel with the 6th Ptolemy about his right to the whole country of Syria, a great sedition fell among the men of power in Judea, and they had a contention about obtaining the government, while each of these that were of dignity could not endure to be subject to their equals. However, Onias, one of the high priests, got the better, and cast the sons of Tobias out of the city, who fled to Antiochus, and besought him to make use of them for his leaders, and to make an expedition into Judea. The king, being thereto disposed beforehand, complied with them, and came upon the Jews with a great army, and took their city by force, and slew a great multitude of those that favored Ptolemy, and sent out his soldiers to plunder them without mercy. He also spoiled the temple, and put a stop to the constant practice of offering a daily sacrifice of expiation for 3 years and 6 months. But Onias, the high priest, fled to Ptolemy, and received a place from him in the Nomus of Hierapolis, where he built a city resembling Jerusalem, and a temple that was like its temple, concerning which we shall speak more in its proper place hereafter. Now Antiochus was not satisfied either with his unexpected taking the city, or with its pillage, or with the great slaughter he had made there, but being overcome with his violent passions, and remembering that he had suffered during the siege, he compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country, and to keep their infants uncircumcised, and to sacrifice swine's flesh upon the altar, against which they all opposed themselves, and the most approved among them were put to death. Bacchides also, who was sent to keep the fortress, having these wicked commands, joined to his own natural barbarity, indulged all sorts of the extremest wickedness, and tormented the worthiest of the inhabitants, man by man, and threatened their city every day with open destruction, till at length he provoked the poor sufferers by the extremity of his wicked doings to avenge themselves. Josephus, Book 1, Article 1 and 2, end of quote. Verse 11. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. I will be quoting extensively from the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which contain the history of this period. No one can understand this section of the book of Daniel who has not read the Maccabees. A little information will be given at this time concerning these books. These books contain the history of the people of God under the command of Judas Maccabees and his brethren. These books were not received by the Jews as canonical, but were received as history. However, during the Middle Ages, namely, the Catholic Church at the Council of Florence in 1439 and the Council of Trent in 1545 to 1563 deemed them canonical and added them to the Old Testament. They are not found today in any of our Protestant Bibles. The author of this commentary regards them as accurate history, and there can be no doubt of their authenticity. Quoting now from 1 Maccabees chapter 1. And after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 140th and 3rd year, and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered proudly into the sanctuary, and took the golden altar, and the candlestick of light, and all the vessels thereof, and the table of showbread, and the pouring vessels, and the vials, and the censers of gold, and the veil, and the crown, and the golden ornaments that were before the temple, all which he pulled off. He took also the silver, and the gold, and the precious vessels. Also he took the hidden treasures which he found. And when he had taken all away, he went into his own land, having made a great massacre, and spoke very proudly. Therefore there was a great mourning in Israel in every place where they were, so that the princes and elders mourned, the virgins and young men were made feeble, and the beauty of women was changed. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 20 through 26, end of quote. Verse 12. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. The following composite of historical facts and forensic evidence should convince any Bible believer that Antiochus Epiphanes fulfills these scriptures. Quoting now from the book of 1 Maccabees, "And pollute the sanctuary and holy people, and should forbid holocaust and sacrifices and atonements to be made in the temple of God, that they should also leave their children uncircumcised, and make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation, to the end they might forget the law and change all the ordinances, and whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. In the selfsame manner wrote he to his whole kingdom, and appointed overseers over all the people, commanding the cities of Judah to sacrifice city by city, and when they had rent in pieces the books of the law which they found, they burnt them with fire." 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 46 through 56, end of quote. Verse 13, "Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, and the transgression of desolations, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot?" This conversation was regarding the time limit that God would permit the transgression of abomination to last. The collation of historical facts presented in this commentary is overwhelming, since the average reader may not have access to the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Extensive quotes are embodied in this book. Quoting now from 1 Maccabees chapter 1, "And whosoever was found with any the book of the testament, or if any committed to the law, the king's command was that they should be put to death. Thus did they, by their authority, unto the Israelites every month, to as many as were found in the cities. Now the 25th day of the month they did sacrifice upon the idol altar, which was upon the altar of God." 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 57 through 59. Quoting again from the book of Maccabees. "Now the 50th day of the month Casleu, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and builded idol altars throughout the city of Judah." End of quote. 1 Maccabees 1, verse 54. Quoting again from the book of 1 Maccabees. "For it was a place to lie in wait against the sanctuary, and an evil adversary to Israel. Thus they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary, and defiled it, insomuch that the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them. Whereupon the city was made a habitation of strangers, and became strange to those that were born in her, and her own children left her. Her sanctuary was laid waste like a wilderness. Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into reproach, her honor into contempt. As had been her glory, so was her dishonor increased, and her excellency was turned into mourning." 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 36 through 40, end of quote. Quoting again from the book of 1 Maccabees. Also that they had pulled down the abomination which he had set up upon the altar in Jerusalem, and that they had compassed about the sanctuary with high walls as before, and his city Bethshura. 1 Maccabees chapter 6 and verse 7, end of quote. Verse 14, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleaned. This calculation would equal 6 years, 110 days. From the time that Antiochus Epiphanes entered Jerusalem and took away the daily sacrifice till the cleansing of the temple was 2,300 days. 171 BC to 165 BC. Wow. God's Word and history's connection proves that prophecy is true in every detail. Quoting again from the book of Maccabees. Maccabeus and his company, the Lord guiding them, recovered the temple and the city. But the altars which the heathen had built in the open street, and also the chapels, they pulled down. And having cleansed the temple, they made another altar, and striking stones, they took fire out of them, and offered a sacrifice after 2 years, and set forth incense and light and showbread. When that was done, they fell flat down and besought the Lord that they might come no more into such troubles. But if they sinned any more against him, that he himself would chasten them with mercy, and that they might not be delivered unto the blasphemous and barbarous nations. Now upon the same day that the strangers profaned the temple, on the very same day it was cleansed again, even the 25th day of the same month, which is Casleu. And they kept the 8 days with gladness, as in the feast of the tabernacles, remembering that not long afore they had held the feast of the tabernacles, when as they wandered in the mountains and dens like beasts. Therefore they bare branches and fair boughs and palms also, and sang psalms unto him that had given them good success in cleansing his place. They ordained also by a common statute and decree that every year those days should be kept of the whole nation of the Jews, and this was the end of Antiochus, called Epiphanes. 2 Maccabees chapter 10, verses 1 through 9, end of quote. They established a feast of dedication, and each year celebrated it. We are told in John chapter 10 and verse 22 that Jesus was in Jerusalem at the feast of dedication and walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. Verse 15. And it came to pass when I, even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then, behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. Under divine orders, someone appears before Daniel in the form of a human being. I will reserve comments on this person until chapter 10, verse 5 and 6. Verse 16. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Uli, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. He looked like a man, he talked like a man, but he had a divine mission, which was to instruct Gabriel to reveal the meaning of the vision to Daniel. Verse 17, so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid, and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. It is evident and collaborated with Scripture truth that the time of the end is not the end of the world. But the latter end of the verse declares that the time of the end shall be the vision. In other words, 150 years later, Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the main subject of the vision, will be brought down to the grave and the temple rededicated and temple worship restored. Verse 18, Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. Daniel was laying face down, unconscious, as though he was in a trance or a dead faint. Now the angel Gabriel touches him and sets him in an upright position. Verse 19, And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. Wow! Gabriel is going to reveal the remaining events of the scene. The rest of the chapter will reveal the secret. There is to be an end of the Medo-Persian, Grecian empire, and of the little horn. The vision ended with the downfall of the little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes. This is the end that verse 17 and 19 are referring to. It is the end of the indignation created by Antiochus Epiphanes. Some pervert the Word of God by trying to show that this is the end of the world. Nothing could be further from the truth. Verse 20, The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. Nothing could be plainer. Cyrus and Darius, the kings of Media and Persia. Verse 21, And the rough goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. No wonder Alexander the Great liked the book of Daniel, because he could see himself in prophecy. Daniel, through the telescope of prophecy, saw the rise of Alexander the Great about 200 years before it happened. Verse 22. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. The single horn is broken, and from its roots come 4 horns. Alexander the Great was broken, and his 4 generals divided the empire and ruled over it. Alexander's kingdom was now divided among his 4 generals. Seleucus ruled Syria and the east. Lysimachus ruled Bithynia and Thrace. Ptolemy Soter ruled Egypt, and Cassander ruled Macedonia. Verse 23. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. Please note that in the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance shall stand up. This gives us double proof that it was Antiochus called Epiphanes. The following will provide verification of the people, date, and events to establish evidence that it could be none other than Antiochus Epiphanes. Quoting from the book of 1 Maccabees. And there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king, who had been a hostage at Rome, and he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days went there out of Israel wicked men, who persuaded many, saying, Let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us. For since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. So this device pleased them well. Then certain of the people were so forward herein that they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinance of the heathen. Whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem according to the custom of the heathen, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. Now, when the kingdom was established before Antiochus, he thought to reign over Egypt, that he might have the dominion of 2 realms. Wherefore he entered into Egypt with a great multitude, with chariots, and elephants, and horsemen, and a great navy, and made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt. But Ptolemy was afraid of him, and fled, and many were wounded to death. Thus they got the strong cities in the land of Egypt, and he took the spoils thereof. Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and every one should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messengers into Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beast. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 10 through 47, end of quote. Then many of the people were gathered unto them, to wit, every one that forsook the law, and so they committed evils in the land. 1 Maccabees 1:52. Quoting again from the book of Maccabees. And they called upon the Lord that he would look upon the people that was trodden down of all, and also pity the temple profaned of ungodly men. 2 Maccabees chapter 8, verse 2, end of quote. Verse 24, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, and he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. Quoting from the book of Maccabees. At which time, according to the commandment, they, Antiochus Epiphanes, put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. And they hanged the infants about their necks, and rifled their houses, and slew them that had circumcised them. Howbeit, many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat any unclean thing. Wherefore the rather to die, that they might not be defiled with meat, and that they might not profane the holy covenant. So then they died, and there was a very great wrath upon Israel. 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verses 60 through 64, end of quote. Quoting again from the book of 2 Maccabees. And it came to pass also that 7 brethren with their mother were taken, and compelled by the king against the law to taste swine's flesh, and were tormented with scourges and whips. But one of them that spake first said thus, What wouldest thou ask or learn of us? We are ready to die, rather than to transgress the laws of our fathers. Then the king, being in a rage, commanded pans and cauldrons to be made hot, which forthwith, being heated, he commanded to cut out the tongue of him that spake first, and to cut off the utmost parts of his body, the rest of his brethren and his mother looking on. Now when he was thus maimed in all his members, he commanded him, being yet alive, to be brought to the fire, and to be fried in the pan. And as the vapor of the pan was for a good space dispersed, they exhorted one another with the mother to die manfully, saying thus, The Lord God looketh upon us, and in truth as comfort in us, as Moses in his song, which witnessed to their faces, declared, saying, And he shall be comforted in his servants. So, when the first was dead, after this number, they brought the second to make him a mocking stock. And when they had pulled off the skin of his head with the hair, they asked him, Wilt thou eat, before thou be punished throughout every member of thy body? But he answered in his own language, and said, No. Wherefore he also received the next torment in order as the former did. And when he was at the last gasp, he said, Thou, like a fury, takest us out of this present life, but the King of the world shall raise us up, who have died for his laws, unto everlasting life. 2 Maccabees, chapter 7, 1 through 9, end of quote. Quoting from 2 Maccabees, chapter 5. He sent also that detestable ringleader Apollonius with an army of 22,000, commanding him to slay all those that were of perfect age, and to sell the women and the younger sort. 2 Maccabees chapter 5, verse 24, end of quote. Verse 25. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princesses, but he shall be broken without hand. Antiochus' policy was slick. He pretended and promised peace. Then when he caught them off guard, he would destroy them. He ran his course and was finally destroyed, and a human hand never touched him. The eternal God that he had opposed struck him with a plague unlike any ever described in medical journals. This man literally rotted in his tracks. He stank so bad that he himself could not stand the smell. In the final days of his life, he was carried in a horse litter. A horse litter was composed of two shafts that were fastened to the collar of the horse and extended about 3 feet behind the horse, to which were affixed a type of lounge. And he pleaded with God, to no avail, that if God would spare his life, he would renovate and restore the temple beyond its original glory, become a Jewish proselyte, have himself circumcised, give all Jews civil rights, and serve the God he had blasphemed. But God broke him without hand, and he died in a strange land in unparalleled agony. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Quoting now from the book of 2 Maccabees. And the man that thought a little afore he could reach to the stars of heaven, no man could endure to carry for his intolerable stink. 2 Maccabees, chapter 9, verse 10, end of quote. Quoting from 2 Maccabees 5, who coming to Jerusalem and pretending peace, did forbear till the holy day of the Sabbath, when taking the Jews keeping holy day, he commanded his men to arm themselves, and so he slew all of them that were gone to the celebrating of the Sabbath, and running through the city with weapons, slew great multitudes. 2 Maccabees, chapter 5, verse 25 and 26, end of quote. Quoting from the book of 1 Maccabees. And I thought with myself, into what tribulation am I come, and how great a flood of misery is it wherein now I am? For I was bountiful and beloved in my power, but now I remember the evils that I did at Jerusalem, and that I took all the vessels of gold and silver that were therein, and sent to destroy the inhabitants of Judea without a cause. 1 Maccabees chapter 6, verse 11 and 12. Quoting again from the book of 2 Maccabees chapter 9. But the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, smote him with an incurable and invisible plague. Or as soon as he had spoken these words, a pain of the bowels that was remediless came upon him, and sore torments of the inner parts, and that most justly, for he had tormented other men's bowels with many and strange torments. Howbeit, he nothing at all ceased from his bragging, but still was filled with pride, breathing out fire in his rage against the Jews, and commanding to haste the journey. But it came to pass, and thus he that a little afore thought he might command the waves of the sea, so proud was he beyond the condition of man, and weighed the high mountains in balance, was now cast on the ground and carried in a horse litter, showing forth unto all the manifest power of God, so that the worms rose up out of the body of this wicked man. And whiles he lived in sorrow and pain, his flesh fell away, and the filthiness of his smell was noisome to all his army. And the man that thought a little afore he could reach to the stars of heaven, no man could endure to carry for his intolerable stink. He, therefore, being plagued, he began to leave off his great pride and to come to the knowledge of himself by the scourge of God, his pain increasing every moment. And when he himself could not abide his own smell, he said these words, "It is meet to be subject unto God, and that a man that is mortal should not proudly think of himself that he were God." This wicked person vowed also unto the Lord, who now no more would have mercy upon him, saying thus, that the holy city, to the which he was going in haste to lay it even with the ground, and to make it a common burial place, he would set at liberty. And as touching the Jews, whom he had judged not worthy so much as to be buried, but to be cast out with their children, to be devoured of the fowls and the wild beasts, he would make them all equal to the citizens of Athens. And the holy temple, before he had spoiled, he would garnish with goodly gifts, and restore all the holy vessels with many more, and out of his own revenue defray the charges belonging to the sacrifices. Yea, and that also he would become a Jew himself, and go through all the world that was inhabited, and declare the power of God. 2 Maccabees chapter 9, verse 5 through 7, end of quote. Quoting again from the book of 2 Maccabees. Thus the murderer and blasphemer, having suffered most grievously as he entreated other men, so died he a miserable death in a strange country in the mountains. 2 Maccabees 9:28, end of quote. Quoting from the book of 1 Maccabees chapter 1. Every bridegroom took up lamentation, and she that sat in the marriage chamber was in heaviness. The land also was moved for the inhabitants thereof, and all the house of Jacob was covered with confusion. And after 2 years fully expired, the king sent his chief collector of tribute unto the cities of Judah, who came unto Jerusalem with a great multitude, and spake peaceable words unto them, but all was deceit. For when they had given him credence, he fell suddenly upon the city, and smote it very sore, and destroyed much people of Israel. And when he had taken the spoils of the city, he set it on fire, and pulled down the house. But the women and children took they captive, and possessed the cattle. They builded the city of David with a great and strong wall, and with mighty towers, and made it a stronghold for them. And they put therein a sinful nation, wicked men, and fortified themselves therein. They stored it also with armor and victuals. And when they had gathered together the spoils of Jerusalem, they laid them up there, and so they became a sore snare, and walls thereof on every side. 1 Maccabees 1:27 through 37. End of quote. So that the worms rose up out of the body of this wicked man, and whilst he lived in sorrow and pain, his flesh fell away, and the filthiness of his smell was noisome to all his army. 2 Maccabees 9, verse 9. Verse 26. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. Daniel is to keep the vision secret for the time being, for it pertains to many days hence. He will, in chapter 11, tell the full story. Verse 27, And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days, Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Daniel lost consciousness. He was exhausted, ill for several days, too sick to go to work, told his boss he is unable to discharge his duties. The vision had taken its toll on Daniel, both mentally and physically.